Hello, and welcome to our program tonight. I'm Jessica Cloud, and I serve as the Vice President for Advancement for Starr King School for the Ministry. I'm pleased to welcome you to our panel discussion, which is Thomas Starr King, Neglected Aspects of His Life and Work. He's our namesake of our school, and we have with us three distinguished scholars to discuss these overlooked aspects of Thomas Starr King and his biography. John Burens is our first scholar on our panel. He was the sixth president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, serving from 1993 to 2001. He was then a visiting professor of ministry at Starr King, where he has twice served on the board of trustees and also taught as adjunct faculty. He's the author of or co-author of 6 books on liberal religion, most recently Conflagration: How the Transcendentalists Sparked the American Struggle for Racial, Gender, and Social Justice, which was published by Beacon Press in 2020. Our second scholar tonight is Sheri Prud'homme. Sheri Prud'homme is the Assistant Professor for Religion and Education at Starr King School for the Ministry, having served in varying capacities on the faculty since the early 2000s. She received her PhD from the Graduate Theological Union in 2016. Her dissertation was entitled Gleam of the Infinite Majesty, the Interplay of Manifest Destiny and Eco-Theology in Thomas Starr King's Construction of Yosemite as Sacred Text. Her book-length history of the First Unitarian Church of Oakland, Gather the Spirit, received the UU History and Heritage Society Congregational History Prize in 2019. And last but not least, we have Dr. Meg Richardson. Meg Richardson serves as Starr King School for the Ministry's Associate Professor of UU History and Associate Dean of Faculty, as well as the Director of the Certificate in Unitarian Universalist Studies. Her PhD in Theology and Church History concerned 19th century British nonconformism, particularly the life and work of Francis William Newman. Thomas Starr King admired Newman's writings, which he wrote belonged to essential spiritual Christianity. And now we'll turn it over to our panelists. Thank you for coming.
Well, I just want to say what a privilege it is to talk with two people who really helped inspire me in writing UU history. Meg understands broad church transcendentalism in the 19th century in a way that I tried to capture in my book about the transcendentalists as social activists. And Sheri, your work on the Oakland Church and your dissertation on Starr King and Yosemite have both been incredibly important to me. In my book on the Transcendentalists, I really try to lift up Starr King as the guy who brings Transcendentalism west. Mm-hmm. One of the things that strikes me about that whole attitude toward Native Americans during the period is that although you get people like Emerson protesting the Cherokee removal and the like, it's almost as though they feel that there's an inevitability. Mm-hmm. There's a resignation, almost, they're transcendentalists, but it's kind of Calvinistic, and there's nothing we can do. The part of Starr King that, oh, by the way, I should introduce him. Here he is looking over my shoulder. This is a bust of Thomas Starr King executed by Laura Woodward Steer in 1952. He's been living in my study for the last several weeks, and the owner, who has just stepped down as the moderator of the San Francisco church, is prepared to donate the bust of Starr King, which I think is really quite wonderful, either to the church or to the school. We'll fight that one out at an appropriate time. But I wanted to say that the part of Starr King's legacy that I think gets most neglected during the period that gets focused on most, mm-hmm. the Civil War period, where he's talked about as this incredible fundraiser for humanitarian relief, and the person who probably helped Lincoln get over the top in the election in 1860 with just 700 and a few votes in a four-way race. His political unionism and abolitionism get a lot of credit. What doesn't get credit is the kind of cultural impact that he had during that period. And I just want to lift up Ben Tarnoff's incredible book, The Bohemians, Mark Twain and the San Francisco writers who reinvented American literature. Now, as somebody who has sometimes been upset with the way my own publishers have wanted to have a title and a subtitle, I will just say, as somebody of Czechoslovakian heritage, I don't like the title. The term Bohemian gets, thrown around as to anybody who is sort of outside the cultural mainstream at any particular moment. And by the way, the book's not about Mark Twain very much. If it's about anybody beyond Jessie Benton Fremont, who really started the first salon in San Francisco at Black Rock in 1860, it's about Thomas Starr King. There are scenes here that people don't know about, like October 19th, 1860, at Black Rock, at Jessie's dinner table. It's Thomas Starr King and Herman Melville. Melville was deeply depressed. He'd gone on a voyage that was supposed to go around the world on a ship called the Meteor that was captained by his own brother. His marriage was a mess. People were not reading his writing, which in many ways was dealing with the problem of evil from a transcendentalist perspective. That's what Moby Dick is. And people didn't like it. Well, one of the things, I wish I could be a fly on the wall at that dinner party because Herman Melville went home. He didn't continue on the rest of the voyage with his brother. Here's a hypothesis. We were talking about how sometimes we historians have to operate by formulating a hypothesis. I think Thomas Starr King may have convinced Herman Melville to go back to New York and vote for Lincoln. It's just possible. In any case, that was certainly what they were talking about that evening. It was just weeks before the national election. And then there's stuff like, well, let's go back to the Native Americans. Another person who frequented Black Rock was Thomas Starr King's young 26-year-old parishioner, Bret Hart. And how does Bret Hart show up in the congregation? He had been the assistant editor of a newspaper up in Uniontown or Arcata, California, when a white settlers group went up and literally slaughtered 300 Native Americans. Black Rock, by the way, was what is in San Francisco now called Upper Fort Mason, and the Fremonts had a cottage there. Well, young Bret Hart, who probably had an identification with the outcast because his father's heritage was Jewish, his mother's was not. Bret Hart lambasted the local people and reported on this massacre of Native Americans, and of course got run out of town. Where does he run to? He runs to San Francisco and becomes a part of Starr King's congregation. Not only that, he marries the paid alto in the choir. And he's a regular guest at Jessie Fremont's table. And after Jessie goes east again to her native Missouri, where her father had been a senator, with her husband, who's placed by Lincoln in charge of the Union armies in the Mississippi Valley, and issues a premature emancipation proclamation, by the way. When Jessie leaves, it's Starr King who takes on this nexus of intellectuals, artists, writers, naturalists, poets, who become the first real intellectual center on the Pacific Coast. And Sheri, when you were at the California Historical Society, you were probably seeing photographs of Yosemite by Carlton Watkins.
Yeah, exactly.
So what you weren't able to do in your thesis was some connecting of dots that my friend Tyler Green has now done, showing how You know, it was the fact that Starr King went up to Yosemite within 3 months of arriving in California.
Mhm.
Wrote about it to the Boston Evening Transcript. Became friends at Jessie's place with Carlton Watkins, and probably was the person who got Watkins to go up to Yosemite and do the first photographs.
Mm.
Well, do you know that the Emerson family ended up with 10 of Carlton Watkins' photographs from Yosemite?
Mm.
2 of them still hang in the Emerson house in Concord.
Mm.
Frederick Billings, who was the lawyer that was part of this unionist intellectual circle, becomes incredibly influential, the head of the Republican Party back in his native Vermont. He's also made a fortune out here. My friend Tyler has now pretty much connected all of the dots in a book that's going to come out called The Battle for Yosemite, proving that Thomas Starr King was the single most important figure in setting aside that incredible place, which I think you're quite right, he experienced as humbling.
Mhm.
Why is it a religious text? Why does he come back into San Francisco and preach a sermon like Yosemites of the Soul,
Mhm.
the living waters of Lake Tahoe, lessons from the Sierra? You know, the kind of religious naturalism that I think becomes more prominent in America later is so advanced in Thomas Starr King, and the writing is so good.
Mhm.
That, of course, what Tyler and I are now set about to do is to, by the time of King's 200th birthday,
Hmm.
which is December 2024, get out an edition of the works of Thomas Starr King, which hasn't been done since Edwin Whipple did a couple of volumes in the 1870s.
Mhm.
There are things in there that are just treasures. I'm editing the early part because that's when Starr King is working out his own religious stance.
Mhm.
And Tyler is more of an art historian. He's got a book out also about the impact of Emerson's first book, Nature, on American artists
Mhm.
like Watkins, about whom he's also a biographer, or Bierstadt, or the Hudson River School of painters who see the natural world as a reflection of something that should be awe-inspiring and humbling,
Mhm. Mhm.
and should bring us to that place of wanting to preserve the creation that is a gift. Well, there's other stuff about Starr King as a cultural figure that I find just fascinating, and that it's not just Bret Hart. Hart gets a sort of sinecure job at the U.S. Mint here in San Francisco as a secretary to the director, Robert Swain, who's the moderator of the Unitarian Church.
Mhm.
I didn't know that the Fremonts took a pew in the church. Just how ecumenical, they were nominally Episcopalians, but Starr King, if he goes up to Yosemite as a Methodist, a liberal Methodist, preach for him. Very broad church,
Mhm.
very close relationship with the local Reform rabbi.
Mhm.
And one of my favorite stories out of his cultural impact is Hart ends up editing a literary magazine called the Overland Monthly. And there's a poem that appears in it anonymously. And Starr King goes down to the best bookstore in the city and encounters this shy 19-year-old closeted gay poet named Charles Warren Stoddard, and says, "I'm told that you may have written these wonderful verses. Is that right?" And Stoddard says, "Yep, actually I did." Well, the upshot of it is incredible. It launches Stoddard's literary career, and he becomes a correspondent with Walt Whitman. And then there's his relationship with Ina Coolbrith, who becomes the first poet laureate of California. And who is Ina? She is the abused niece of the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith.
I did not know that. Oh.
Harnoff. And, you know, the way she works through her courage. She, by the way, becomes the first director of the public library in Oakland. All through a Unitarian network that's part of what Starr King sets up.
Wow, yeah.
So, you know, you couldn't quite prove, Sheri, that he was the key guy on Yosemite. But,
well, I had a hunch, but I mean, that wasn't quite the direction of my dissertation. Because, and if I can actually just go back a little bit to this religious contribution.
yes.
But yeah, you're right. I didn't quite get there. And I'm so excited you and Tyler are going to get there and really actually make it.
I actually did it in my Harvard Magazine piece. You know, I was surprised that Harvard approached me about writing a short piece about Starr King, because I mentioned him in my book that they covered and so forth. And I mentioned that I was going to edit his works. Well, there's other stuff I've come across. You'll love this, Meg. I found a literary reference to Abraham Lincoln mourning Thomas Starr King.
Mm-hmm.
The painter, F.B. Carpenter, who did the portrait of Lincoln and his cabinet that was used on the Team of Rivals on the cover. It hangs in the US Capitol. He spent 6 months living at the White House in 1864. And he wrote a book about it. And he describes a conversation with Lincoln. It's mostly about Senator Edward Baker, who had been a personal friend of Lincoln's from Illinois days, had been the leading voice of the Union out here, even before Starr King. He died at one of the early battles in the Civil War. Starr King did his funeral. And the whole conversation is about not only Baker, who was a personal friend of Lincoln's, but what a tragedy it is for the nation that Thomas Starr King has died.
Mm-hmm.
And then Carpenter goes on in somewhat florid prose to say that he's writing this in 1866. Now, all three of them are in the next world where they can commune with one another. Lincoln, Starr King, and Baker. Another piece that I found fascinating was to discover that even before he came out here to California, he was so well regarded in the East by people like the Quaker poet, John Greenleaf Whittier, that Whittier had 3 portraits in his study across from where he wrote. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Thomas Starr King.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because Starr King often ended his lectures out on the Lyceum Circle by reading one of Whittier's poems.
Nice.
And out here, he read Bret Hart's poems at the end of his Union lectures. But I think the other big thing that has just blown me away is how little people have dug into Starr King's prodigious late adolescence. You know, his father died when he was 15, not quite 15, 1839. And between the age of 15 and 20, you know, this guy masters Latin, Greek, French. He becomes the principal of a grammar school in which Latin and Greek were the principal subjects at the age of 18.
Mm-hmm.
That's, thank you, Hosea Ballou II, by the way. The next year, he meets Theodore Parker, who has a huge library and reads 19 languages. And Parker says, wonderful young man, free reign of my library. Later, when Starr King succeeds his father at age 20 and then moves into Boston as minister of the Hollis Street Church, Parker, who had drawn off the best people from the Hollis Street Church by starting the 28th Congregational Society, calls Thomas Starr King the best preacher in Boston. Another tidbit that I was stunned to discover was who called Thomas Starr King to the Hollis Street Church? Margaret Fuller's uncle Henry was the chair of the calling committee. So there's just all of this wonderful stuff. He had chutzpah. You know, he's 22 years old when he goes down to New York City and meets Henry Whitney Bellows, who was the most influential Unitarian minister in the country. I'm here to introduce myself.
And that's how he gets to San Francisco.
Yeah.
Bellows asks him to come.
Yeah, Bellows tried to get him to be the minister of the church that Rosemary Bray McNatt first affiliated with, who became the Community Church of New York. And they turned him down because he didn't have a college degree. And I teased them about that when the last time I preached in the Community Church pulpit. But he saved the Hollis Street Church, which was a terribly troubled congregation. There's a whole bit about the Hollis Street Council trying to intervene between them and their long-term minister, John Pierpont. And he saves the Hollis Street Church. And because of that, at age 24, Harvard gives him an honorary master's degree. One of the other things that Tyler, I think, has pretty definitively proven has to do with what troubled Thomas Starr King all through his life. I think Tyler is right that he had chronic tuberculosis. He may have died of diphtheria on top of that at the age of only 39. But he probably had tuberculosis that had, believe it or not, settled in his left hand. And he always appears in photographs and the like with his hand gloved. So I spent this summer up in the White Hills, going to Mount Starr King, because he's the only guy who's got mountains in both the Sierras at Yosemite at the head of the valley, and then the White Mountains of New Hampshire named after him. And I hope that there's going to be a revival of interest in him in these years that lead up to his bicentenary, and especially around the school that's named for him, because he's a remarkable figure, not only in bringing transcendentalism to the West as this kind of broad church, y'all come, spiritual insight from every place, welcome, but somebody who understands what a gift the natural world is and how petty it is to separate ourselves on the basis of race and ethnicity. That those are things that, of course, are important, but they should not separate and divide. One of the things that I want to dig into more is how it happened that the church that he started preaching in, which was on Stockton Street, seated 1,000 people, in which he filled to overflowing, so that they had to build a bigger building for him on Union Square that seated 1,500. How did it happen that that building was sold to an African-American congregation? There were only 3 in the city at the time. It was sold to the most activist Black congregation, the AME Zion congregation, whose minister was also the principal of the only Black school in the city. And it was sold for approximately, as near as I can tell, 1/3 of its value. In other words, he talked the trustees into letting go of that property for a social purpose. As near as I could, again, it's a hypothesis. Further hypothesis, I think the person who brought the money was Mary Ellen Pleasant, the first really wealthy African-American woman in the United States, who'd made a fortune in laundries and boarding houses here in the city, and then masqueraded as a nanny so that people wouldn't go after her out of jealousy.
Wow.
But she was also a woman who took money to John Brown. Believe me, it ain't going to be easy to find anything written about that kind of stuff. The best you can do sometimes is to see that these people were in juxtaposition to one another, that there had to be a relationship. And that it's worth digging into. Isn't that the way we proceed with history, Meg? Yeah. Well, I think I've talked too much. You didn't interrupt me enough. I challenged you both to do that. But we're about to wind up this period and get to some of the questions that I hope have appeared in either the Q&A or the chat. I'm glancing at my clock and I want to leave the time for questions. While we're doing that, I want to also take a beat here and tell you why I support the school that is named for Thomas Starr King. When I was president of the association, I was struck by the fact that the ministers that I most admired, who had deep authenticity and really effective leadership skills, came more often than not from Starr King. And then Dudley Muir, the associate dean for ministry at my alma mater at Harvard Divinity School, actually did a study and proved that Starr King grinds out more successful Unitarian Universalist ministers and leaders. I could go on about all of the people that I have known and admired who have been graduates of the school over the years. And I can't tell you how much it meant to me to discover that a scholarship named for me, not with my money, but by people who appreciated my leadership at the UUA, that scholarship was combined with the Jeffrey Campbell Scholarship this year to provide an opportunity for an African-American woman to enroll in the school in her first year. And I support the school because it's at the cutting edge of doing social justice work and is probably the most progressive and effective theological school in North America. And I say that as somebody who served on the accreditation commission for the American Theological Association for a number of years and got a look at all of the options in liberal religious education. So I'm asking people to become donors to Starr King, as I am. And I want to turn to my dear friend, Rosemary Bray McNatt, to just say a word about what's up with the, you're in a new house, Rosemary.
We're in a new house. I want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon / evening. I am excited to hear these pieces of research, not only from John, but from Sheri and Meg. And it's a constant reminder to me about what is the intellectual heft of Starr King. Most people think of us as an activist institution, and we very much are. But that activism is undergirded by a significant intellectual reach. And it's not just in areas of history like Meg and Sheri, but it's also our ethicists, our world authority on moral injury, Gabrielle Latini, and a host of other people who are continuing to keep us on the cutting edge. We are now in a new home on the campus of Mills College. We are still teaching virtually until January out of issues of safety for COVID, but everybody's vaccinated because you can't be on Mills campus or in Starr King unless you are. So we're doing what we can to keep people safe, but we expect in late January to return to full-time work at the school. Your support means so much to us. and allows us to continue creating forward-thinking scholar activists for the next generation of Unitarian Universalism and progressive religious leaders, because almost a third of our students are progressive religious leaders in other traditions. Hindus, Buddhists, indigenous religions, pagans, they come to Starr King because they know that what they most need, they will find with us. So I want to thank you again for coming. I want to urge your support, and I want to throw it back to John and Sheri and Meg for questions, because I've been geeking out on the history part of this. I'm a frustrated church historian. My era is 19th century British Unitarians and their relationship to the anti-lynching movement. And I've actually identified a scholar in England who has been working on the same thing. So she and I are going to commune with one another shortly. Please take it away.
Yeah, let me just say a word about a legacy that Thomas Starr King left for his successor in the pulpit here in San Francisco, Horatio Stebbins. He was a trustee of the College of California, which was a small private institution based in Oakland that had been gifted a major tract of land north of Oakland in what later was called Berkeley. Without Thomas Starr King, Horatio Stebbins wouldn't have become essentially the most important figure in founding the University of California. Another legacy in the congregation was the governor of the state, Frederick Lowe. Two successive governors of California were part of Thomas Starr King's congregation, first Leland Stanford and then Frederick Lowe. Lowe, by the way, is the one who appoints Frederick Law Olmsted as the first superintendent of Yosemite. But he also comes to his minister, Horatio Stebbins, and says, we want to have a state university. You've got a small college with some land in Berkeley. I've got the money, you've got the land. How about we start a university? People don't know how incredibly important it was that Unitarians like Lowe and Stebbins started the University of California. And here's another little tidbit I've discovered about Stebbins. This is going to be in my new book, which is called A Religious Center with a Civic Circumference, Unitarians in San Francisco since 1850. Only at the very end of his life did Mark Twain admit how desperate and even suicidal he was in 1865, 1866, when he went through what he called his slinking period. He couldn't get published in the San Francisco papers. He was slinking from boarding house to boarding house without being able to pay his bill. And he writes a letter to his mother and says, "You'd be proud of me, Ma. I'm thick as thieves with the Reverend Dr. Stebbins." Again, I can't quite prove all of it, but there's every reason to believe that Horatio Stebbins saved Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, from committing suicide and paid his bill at the boarding house. And this is documented, wrote a letter of introduction to Henry Whitney Bellows, so that when Clemens went to New York, he was introduced to all of the literary people there and started a successful literary career. This is what effective ministers do. They save lives. They turn around lives. They may not always know during their lifetime that they've done it. They contribute to culture and to social justice in ways that are never seen and maybe can never quite be proved. But believe me, these things really happen and make a difference that is far greater than we often recognize. And with that, I'll stop and let Jessica introduce some of the questioners so that we can dialogue with them.
Yes, I am excited about some of these questions. I am going to put the address of the school because we have moved. So if you want to send a check and become a donor to the school, you'll have to do it at our new address, which is in the chat. And you can just go to the website where you registered for this event, which is now conveniently a giving form. So you feel free to do that while you listen to the answers to these questions. We have several So a couple of comments from Leland Von Upson,
Great.
and then a question. Carlton E. Watkins is dear to me and many Northwesterners because of his photographs of the Columbia River Gorge. Also, Starr King preached the first liberal sermon on the Pacific Northwest in Portland in 1862 as part of the plan to establish a Unitarian church there. Mount Starr King in the Sierras is a three-peaked granite dome mountain within Yosemite National Park. I've often wondered if this was a little joke by a Trinitarian politician. And then Leland says, is Jessie Fremont related to the explorer John C. Fremont?
Yeah, that was her husband.
Oh.
Yes, who was the Republican candidate, the anti-slavery candidate for president in 1856. He couldn't even manage to carry California, where he had briefly been a US senator, but they were the most important anti-slavery unionist political figures in the city. Fremont had become the owner of the Mariposa mining operation, which is kind of at the entrance to Yosemite and what's now called Kings Canyon. And Watkins was hired by Fremont to go up and take pictures of Mariposa as part of his attempt to get New York investors to help him with the more capital intensive mining operation that he had planned up there. By the way, when Starr King goes up to Oregon in 1862, you're right. The history of the church in Portland sadly never mentions that Starr King was there the year before they actually got started. I was disappointed to see that. He actually went all the way up through Puget Sound to Victoria, British Columbia. Why? He had been surprised by a large cash gift sent from Victoria, British Columbia to support the Union cause.
He was a great fundraiser.
Yeah, he was a great fundraiser. It was sent by African Americans.
Wow.
Who had left California in disgust in 1859 over school segregation and the fact that the legislature had passed a law that said that they could not testify in court. And they left the United States for Victoria, British Columbia, but they sent Starr King money to support the Union cause. And he went all the way with Julia to Victoria to say thank you, which is what good fundraisers do.
I had never heard that story. That is incredible. That was worth the whole thing to me. This whole hour. And there's great stuff in this hour, but I never heard that.
Isn't that amazing?
It is totally amazing.
Yeah. There's stuff that you discover you have to read a lot of secondary sources. Mm-hmm. And then you have to dig into the primary sources. Mm-hmm. Because the secondary sources give you these little hints or hypotheses.
Yeah.
And then you have to go and see, well, is it in somebody's journal? The great thing that has happened, of course, in historical research is that out-of-print books are now often digitized and available.
Right, they are.
You can read the newspapers from the 1850s online. And that, even 10 years ago, when, the last person who was really trying to do work on Starr King, but mostly as a political activist here in California, was during her work, Lana Matthews. Good work, but there was so much that was not available to her.
You couldn't get it.
Now is. And by the way, the big thing that Tyler and I are going to be working on is the treasure trove of his original manuscripts that are held at the Boston Public Library. 379 lectures, sermons, reviews, poems by Thomas Starr King.
See, I find that stunning. I find it absolutely stunning that no one has looked at this all these years.
And the reputation of intellectual movements and individuals, goes up and down.
Yeah.
We know that.
And Glenna tells the story of trying to get a book about Thomas Starr King published.
Published, that's
The
right.
publisher was like, nope.
They want
don't do it.
nothing
No
to
one
do
will
with
want
it.
Right?
No.
So it's got to be about California and the Civil War, and then she wove Starr King in it, right?
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
Right.
And, you know, and she's trying to write about the same time that Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Republicans in Sacramento are replacing the statue of Starr King.
That's right.
I actually have a question about that, John.
With a statue of Ronald Reagan.
That's
I was
right.
in Sacramento last Thursday with my good friend and colleague, Millie Phillips. We were both presenting a letter and petition signed by faith leaders trying to get domestic workers, who are mostly women of color, covered by occupational safety laws here in California. And, you know, I got to see where Starr King is being relocated. It's a respectable spot.
So
Where
someone
is it?
know, John.
On the grounds of the state capitol.
Okay.
That was one of our questions. That was in the Q&A. Is
I
if it
thought
was
they put it
removed-
in a warehouse somewhere.
Yeah, where was it removed to? So
On the grounds of
Very
the
good.
state capitol.
That's great.
another question, and Sheri, you might have some insight into this one, is are there any connections between Starr King and John Muir?
Oh, I was thinking a TED question. I have an answer for that one prepared if we want to go back to that. But Starr King and John
Okay.
Muir, I dug for that because that would have been really handy for my dissertation. And I couldn't find it.
No, there's an indirect one.
It's
Sheri.
it's just indirect,
Yeah.
right? There's no it's not like I could find evidence that John Muir read Starr King or anything like that, but he does cite off of Mount Starr King in some of his like talking about Yosemite. So like he's clearly aware of Starr King, and maybe you have found more than that, John, but
No, I would just say Muir comes here from Wisconsin, where he studied at the university, and his major professor was a Unitarian. And the professor's spouse, whose name escapes me at the moment, becomes his lifelong correspondent. But it's because Muir is an Emersonian that there's a connection. And by the way, when Ralph Waldo Emerson or Theodore Parker could not keep a lecture engagement, they often recommended Thomas Starr King.
mhm.
His most popular lecture was called Substance and Show. And it is just it's a deconstruction of the kind of insubstantial showmanship that passed for religious leadership or political leadership in that era. It's a common man send up of pretentious blowhards. He also gave lectures on Socrates that brought the fountainhead of Western philosophy to life for working class people. So he was a far more respected literary and lecture platform figure than he's been given credit for. If there's a complete biography of him due, it's got to deal with this, I think, very complicated childhood, including the loss of a father, and adolescence and young adulthood, where he just excels and has the chutzpah to win the respect of of Emerson and Parker and some of the leading people, and James Walker, the president of Harvard.
Yeah.
And then, to see him as not just an impact on politics.
Yeah, I want to read one comment.
Also on culture.
I want to read one more comment just so we get it out there. I think it's interesting. And then we're going to end with what I think is a really good question from Ted Fetter. Barbara Meyer says, when we were starting the UU Church in Fremont, one of the names we considered for the church was Jessie Benton Fremont UU Church, but decided not to because she wasn't a Unitarian. And we named ourselves after Mission Peak, which is in Fremont. So thank you, Barbara, for sharing that.
What I did discover is that she and her husband owned a pew in the Unitarian Church in San Francisco, which is as close as in those days you could be to being a quote member.
Right.
So, you know, I'd claim her.
Did they sign your book, your membership book, John?
No, there were no membership books.
There was just pew rentals, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so we'll have this as our closing question. I just want to thank our panel for doing this today. It's been really interesting to explore more about our namesake, Thomas Starr King. Okay, from Ted, please share more information about Starr King's work and actions related to Chinese immigrants. You've mentioned his support for African Americans and disregard for indigenous people in California, but where was he related to the Chinese?
Well, the Chinese immigration was not a particularly vital issue when Thomas Starr King was here. The immigration was small. It becomes huge right about the time he dies, because Chinese immigrants are imported in order to complete the Transcontinental Railroad over the next decade. And then in the 1870s, there is a huge anti-Chinese political movement, basically stirred up by politicians, demagogues, sort of proto-Trumpians. Dennis Kearney was a working class demagogue who stirred up a whole mob in the 1870s in San Francisco against the Chinese immigrants and the like. Stebbins, his successor.
But hang on, John, before we venture too far from the from Chinese Americans or Chinese immigrants, I think that his relationship to them was complex.
Yes.
That there's plenty of evidence that definitely people of Chinese ancestry gave a lot of money to the Sanitary Commission, right? So there's definitely, again, relationship, connection. Like many of the transcendentalists, he had been exposed to Confucianism, though he maintained forever, like a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant is at the top of his pyramid.
Right.
And I think
like James Truman Clark in that regard.
Yeah, right. So, but there was a respect for Confucianism, and he certainly advocated for the civic rights for Chinese Americans, even while his own personal, like in his letters and that kind of thing, the cultural bridge was uncomfortable for him. The way when he first came to San Francisco and what he saw of behaviors made him uncomfortable, like hanging out laundry, basic kinds of things like that, right?
Well, he actually uses a very offensive term. He says that he saw the streets being bilious with Chinese people.
Yeah, so he's very pejorative in his language, and also he did manage to advocate for civil rights for Chinese immigrants.
Yeah,
so
which Stebbins gets really courageous about, and one of the things
really
that I'm going to try in my book to redeem a little bit of Horace Davis on this subject.
But don't you also find, and you've done a lot of work in transcendentalism, I still remember understanding even who were active as abolitionists and civil rights folks in this period did not believe in social equality for Black people, for example, or for anybody else. So I think it's important for us to keep a balanced idea about it. They didn't believe in slavery, but they weren't going to sit next to you at dinner, and they didn't necessarily want to go to school with you. All right. So, but for their time and in that situation,
that's right,
they were pretty good. But we can't confuse it with what we think of now as 21st century activism, because it's not there.
No. One of the ironies, Rosemary, is that belief in evolution fueled racialism. There was a hierarchy of racism.
That's right.
Some people are
the scientific
less
racism
evolved than others.
Yep, that's right.
And that's pervasive in the culture.
Absolutely.
It's one of these things that, like nostalgia for the or fatalism with regard to the fate of Native Americans, you're just going to find everywhere, and even the best people did not entirely pull themselves out of that form of racialism.
That's right.
So,
and there's still, even within Unitarianism, was like a real diversity, right? So Charles James is criticizing systemic racism as
Right.
a reason why Chinese Americans aren't more integrated into culture.
That's right.
Right. And so that's on one hand. I mean, so we had a big spectrum among Unitarians in this regard. Well, and he was unusual. Charles Ames was not the
Right.
average Unitarian. He was
Right.
on the edge.
I just finished reading Frances Ellen Watkins' novel, Iola Leroy.
Oh gosh, I haven't read that in years. Wow.
And, here in 1892, she's still dealing with, one of the issues we decided to avoid, for example, which is the sort of one drop theory of,
Oh, right.
yeah, it's big in that novel.
Huge.
Meg and I have this ongoing dialogue about whether it's worth trying to prove that maybe when Thomas Starr King was writing to his boyhood friend Randolph Ryer and teasing him as an octoroon,
Oh, really?
black scamp, whether there was something actually based in Ryer having some mixed racial heritage or not. And that may never be solved. At least one of Thomas Starr King's biographers, Munzingo, thinks that there's no question that Ryer was of mixed racial origin, and that's tied up with stuff. I don't know. That's one of those unprovables, probably.
Absolutely.
That we'll just have to deal with. Short of DNA tests, you'll love this. I did discover that one of the ministers of the church here in San Francisco in the 1920s fathered a child on the church organist. That child was raised as the child of the organist's husband. I discovered this because through ancestry.com and newspapers.com, I got in correspondence with the grandson from that union, who is alive and kicking here in San Francisco and has proven the whole thing by DNA testing.
Wow. That's better than Law and Order. They do the backdoor versions of DNA to find people.
I'm of the school of historians that says if you stumble across something like that, tell the truth.
I'm aware that we're at 5 o'clock.
Uh-oh,
I just want to say
we're having too much fun.
for all of you who tuned in. It's so exciting.
It is.
Thank you all so much for being here. We're so grateful to you.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.